It's a popular myth that sewing is an expensive hobby. However, in reality, it can also be done on a budget. In this video, I want to share 15 of my most used sewing tools, all of which cost 5 euros or less, and some of them cost nothing at all. Let's begin with the timeless classic, measuring gauge. The classic gauge is 6-inch length. On one side of the gauge we have centimeters and on the other edge inches. In the middle there's a slider that allows to very precisely measure small distances such as seam allowance, buttonhole placement, hems, pleats, gathers, and so on. For extra quick marking, centimeter column is exactly half centimeter width and inch column is 1/4 inch width. On inch side we also have notches at every inch. The sharp corner at the top makes it easier to turn and press corners, and if you put pin at the small hole right here, you can draw curves or circles, though this is not the function that I have used often. Now, the only downside of this particular tool is that it's made from very lightweight aluminum, which means that it bends very easy. But other than that, it's fantastic classic tool, and I do consider this to be a must-have. Speaking about measuring tools, another tool that I use very often is the triangle ruler with 90 and 45-degree angles. When you're sewing, or especially if you like creating your own patterns, the 90-degree and 45-degree angles are the angles that we use the most. I mostly use 90-degree angle when cutting pattern piece on the fold. Let's say we have to cut a skirt. If we use any other angle at the fold line, we don't get a smooth transition at the top. While if we follow the 90-degree rule, we get a very smooth top line. 90-degree angle also helps us easier position fabric according to the grain, while the 45-degree angle marks the perfect cut for bias. The ruler that I have is a very simple ruler from the stationery set that I bought from grocery store many years ago, like literally when I was still at school, and I use it to this day. If you like making your own patterns or making your own bias tape, this is a great tool to have. And while we're on topic of the bias tape, another great tool to add is the bias tape maker. With the help of the bias tape maker, we can very quickly make our own bias tape. Simply take a strap of fabric, cut on bias that is twice the width that you want in a finished bias tape. Push the strap through the bias tape maker with the wrong side facing up and pin the top of the strap to the ironing board. Then, holding on this little handle right here, simply start pulling the bias tape maker and instantly pressing with a steam iron the tape that's coming out to set it in place. And this is it, you have created your own bias tape. Bias tape makers come in different widths and they also can come in set. Ever since getting these bias tape makers, this is the only way how I create bias tape, and I especially like to match the bias tape with the project that I'm making or use fabric scraps to create my own bias tape at home. I mentioned that some sewing tools don't cost a thing, and this is one of them. This is a simple piece of paper that has tons of values at your sewing space. Now, there are several ways how you can use thicker paper at sewing. One way how to use it is whenever you're sewing through bulky seam connections, just take a little piece of the paper, fold it several times and slip it behind the presser foot to lift it and make it parallel to the metal plate of the sewing machine. This way, the presser foot evenly presses and makes sewing through bulky seam connection much easier. Another great alternative how to use the thicker paper is when you need to sew very precise details such as shirt colors. Now, for this you want to take the thicker paper and cut out the pattern piece without any seam allowance. Put the piece of paper underneath the presser foot so that the needle goes right along the edge of the paper and start sewing the delicate detail. Using this method, you will very simply be able to sew even the most sharp and accuracy requiring corners. But the most important way how you can use thicker paper is pressing. When you want to press seam allowance or darts, simply take a piece of thicker paper and slip it underneath the dart and then press the dart or seam. This way, the edge of the dart or the seam allowance won't be pressed to the fabric and it won't create a visible line on the right side of the garment. For this method, it's best to use paper that is not colored. And for that, I like to use the back of the drawing albums that my son likes to use. It's perfect thickness and it has no color on it, so there's no chance that the color from the paper will transfer onto the fabric. This pressing tip is one of many classic sewing and pattern making tips that I'll be sharing in my upcoming skirt sewing, pattern making and fitting course. In this course, we will be creating two classic silhouette fully lined skirts that uses patterns created based on body measurements. I created this course to give you a feel that you're sitting close to me when sewing, and I show every single step, every single detail, and not only show you how to do it, but I also explain why we're doing every step, because I think understanding why is the fundamental step in the learning process. The course is pre-recorded and self-paced, and you'll be able to use the techniques from this course in many of your future projects. The course launches on September 7th, and I'll leave a link to pre-order in the description box below, including a special discount code for pre-order. Now let's continue with our video. Now, talking about pressing tools, I want to share a few more great sewing tools to have that will help you with pressing, and one of them is the faux organza sheath. I use this see-through faux organza sheath whenever I'm pressing delicate fabrics and I want to prevent them from shine. The organza sheath adds an extra layer between the metal hot iron and your fabric, and thus it protects those shiny, very delicate fabrics from getting the very specific iron shine. I bought this cloth literally at the fabric store. I think it's 30 centimeters in length and it's see-through. It's very easy to use. You can use it for a very, very long time, and it was such a cheap but very, very helpful item to have in your pressing station. Now, another pressing tool that I've used a lot in the past before I got the steam iron is a cheese cloth. Now, to use a cheesecloth, it's very, very simple. You put it in the water and then squeeze all excess water out of it. Then you put that damp cheesecloth on top of the seam that you want to press, and then using your regular iron, you simply press it until the cloth is completely dry. This gives exactly the same effect as using a steam iron. It just takes a little bit more time. Again, this is something that I simply bought at the fabric store. Incredibly cheap, but such a helpful item to have. Now, speaking of other incredibly cheap items to have is the bar of soap. Now, if you like to use hard soap whenever you're washing hands, you may want to save that very, very thin sliver at the end and use it to mark fabrics, especially coat wool fabrics. Soap stays much better and much longer on these fabrics than, let's say, chalk. It's not as easily wipeable, but it instantly dissolves in water. If you don't use hard soap, you can buy a Taylor's bar of soap at a sewing supply store. This is what I did a few years back. It literally cost maybe 50 cents, something like that. I use it quite a lot, and as you can see, it still looks as good as new. Another great marking tool to have is the marking wheel. At the bottom, the marking wheel has a tiny disc that when you move it on the fabric, it dispenses a very small amount of chalk, leaving a very thin but very clear and very visible chalk line. One of the best benefits of this particular tool is that it doesn't drag the fabric when you mark it, so it works great even with very slippery, delicate fabrics. Now, admittedly, this particular tool cost more than €5 because I wanted to buy this particular tool, and so I paid a lot for shipping, but there are quite good cheaper alternatives from Clover or Prim that work just as good. I bought this tool a year ago and I've been using it ever since, and since then it has become my #1 used marking tool, and I have never used simple regular chalk ever again. If you've been watching my channel for a while, you do know that I do love my thimble. Now, I didn't start using thimble right when I started sewing. In fact, for several years I didn't use it at all. But when I started going to the sewing school, on the very first day my teacher said, "Yulia, you need to get a thimble." I have to admit, my first reaction was saying no, because I had already a few years of sewing practice, so I thought I didn't need this tool. But then I stopped myself and I thought, if I'm taking time to go to the sewing school, I will listen to my teacher who has 45 years of professional sewing experience, and I will do as she's telling me to do. It took me a few days to get used to this, but now I use it every single time I need to hand sew anything, and even if I need to base stitch a very short seam, I will surely be grabbing my trusted thimble. Now, I know that some sewists say that the thimble is not comfortable, so here are a few tips. You can buy thimbles that are different sizes, and if you're not comfortable with using metal thimble, try using silicone or leather thimbles. A thimble protects your finger from the needle, and when you need to pierce those extra thick fabrics, it gives you extra strength for pushing. Now, one sewing tool I did not expect to have such a massive effect, but it did, are these thin glass head pins. Now, these pins are much thinner than regular pins, and because of that I can use it on more lightweight, delicate fabrics, or use it when sewing knit fabrics. Also, these pins have a glass head, meaning that I can press over these pins and the top will not melt, which might happen with the pins that have regular plastic head. I also benefit a lot from having a single big dull needle with a very large eye. Now, primarily I use this needle to finish the serger seam. Whenever you're finishing the serger seam, simply drive the fabric away, leaving long thread tails. Push those thread tails through the big needle, and then using the needle, bring the thread tails back into the seam, creating a very beautiful and very durable seam finish. Not only that, but whenever I'm working with chunky knit fabrics, I will use this needle instead of my regular hand sewing needle to mark the grain line. Now, because this needle is very dull, it does not catch the fabric threads, and thus it makes marking much easier. Another cheap item that I'm very glad I bought is a bodkin. Bodkin is used to feed a strap or elastic through a funnel. Secure one end of the strap in the bodkin, then push it through the funnel. Now, a lot of sewists like to use a safety pin for this, and I used it in the past as well, but now that I have a bodkin, this is my preferred method how to feed straps or elastics through funnel. If you're struggling with sewing straight lines or curves, a magnetic seam guide is a very useful item to have in your sewing tool collection. Place the magnet on the metal plate of your sewing machine. Align the long edge parallel to the presser foot if you're sewing the straight line, and align the short edge if you're sewing curves. The magnetic seam guide works as a barrier and allows you to sew the seam always the same distance from the fabric edge, even if you're sewing curves. This tool works best on sewing machines that have large metal plates, and it's a very simple, very useful item to have. One sewing tool that I surprisingly use very often is the seam gauge. It has most popular seam allowance markings: 1 cm, 1.5, 2 cm, 3 cm, 4 cm, and 6 cm mark. I use it mostly when I'm pressing hems, and it always gives very accurate results. I have a metal tool, but if you want, you can create this very same tool from a thicker paper, and in this way it won't cost you anything. Last but definitely not the least is the twin needle. Now, I love wearing and sewing knit garments, so for me, using a twin needle is a must. Now, I primarily use twin needle whenever I'm having knit fabric. From the right side of the garment, twin needle creates 2 rows of stitches, and underneath it creates a zigzag, and because of that zigzag, the seam is stretchy. I don't have a cover stitch machine at home, so for me pairing serger and twin needle on my sewing machine is a perfect substitute for that. Not only that, but you can also use twin needle to create pin tucks or decorative seams. I share more about sewing knit fabrics in this video that you may want to watch next. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I will see you next time. Bye!